Here to talk about the Republican efforts to disenfranchise Texas voters, longtime friend of the pod, Beto O'Rourke. Beto, welcome back.
Hey, John, good to see you. Thanks for having me.
So you and Julian Castro and a bunch of others spoke at a protest outside the state capitol in Austin over the weekend, a day after the Texas House advanced a bill that would make it harder to vote, which you called perhaps the single greatest attack on our democracy. So back when Georgia passed a law with similar voting restrictions, Nate Cohn of the New York Times set off this big debate when he said that all of the political science, research, and data show that expanding voting options to make it more convenient, drop boxes, vote by mail, early voting, hasn't actually seemed to have a huge effect on turnout or electoral outcomes. What do you say to that?
I don't know. I haven't seen the, underlying data or research. I can just tell you that everything that Republicans have done in Texas over the last couple of decades has made it a lot harder to vote in Texas. And it's not just an opinion. You look at the Election Law Journal. They rank Texas 50th out of 50 states in ease of registering to vote and actually voting. You look at our voter turnout on the eve of the 2018 election, we were dead last in the country. I think we've now moved up to like 46th or 45th in voter turnout. And that was after a banner voter turnout year for Texas in 2020, where we broke our own internal records in Texas that still left us 46th in the country in turnout. So when you close 750 polling locations over the last 8 years, implement the most onerous voter ID laws, have what 3-judge federal panel calls a racial gerrymander of your state, you make it really hard on people. And you don't make it hard on all people. You make it particularly hard on some people, like Black voters, Mexican-American voters, voters with disabilities, very old voters, very young voters, and voters in big cities. Those are the same set of voters that these new voter suppression bills are targeting now. And I think it's the greatest attack on democracy since the 65 Voting Rights Act, only because when you connect it to Georgia, Florida, Kansas, Arizona, 42 other state legislatures, and 360 other voter suppression bills, you really get a sense of the scale and scope. And it's not unconnected to the insurrection on the 6th of January, the big lie trafficked by Trump and his acolytes, and everything else that the Republicans are doing, essentially not only to make it harder for Democrats to vote, but harder for democracy to survive.
What are the provisions in the current version of the legislation that most alarm you?
I think the most alarming provision is the free rein given to poll watchers in quotes. These are partisan intimidators who can come to a polling place and question voters, harass voters. In this legislation, videotape voters while they're trying to cast their ballots. And what we know from the history of poll watching in Texas is that it's not an objective, apolitical, nonpartisan affair. It is typically used by the dominant white power structure in Texas. It was used by Democrats at the beginning of the 20th century. It's used by Republicans at the beginning of the 21st century. But the consistent thread is the white men in power to keep Black voters from fully participating in the franchise. In fact, this legislation makes it almost impossible to eject a poll watcher from a polling place. Like the election judge has almost no recourse under this legislation. When you combine that with the attack on those with disabilities who'd have to disclose private, personal medical information while voting, when you look at the end of 24-hour voting, which really helped shift workers in a state where the minimum wage is $7.25 an hour, when you look at the limitation on the number of polling places and voting machines within them, which is only going to exacerbate those really long lines that we see in Texas, 6, 7, 8 hours long, then you understand just how bad this is.
What's the strategy to stop this thing now that it's passed the House? Is the fight over, or is there still time to get rid of some of the worst provisions as they go to conference committee?
There's still time to make this better and potentially, and hope springs eternal with me, potentially even stop this. So a version has passed the state Senate, a version has passed the state House. They're fairly different from one another, so they have to be reconciled in a conference committee. and the differences ironed out, and have to go back to both chambers for additional votes. And then they have to be sent to Governor Greg Abbott's desk for signature if it makes it out of that process. In that conference committee will be House Democrats. We give them more leverage to bring this into compliance with, frankly, the law, the Constitution, and what we'd like to see for voting rights if we turn up the pressure on all state legislators. So if you're in Texas, call your state rep, call your state senator, tell them you want them to vote against SB 7, Senate Bill 7, and HB 6 and SB 7. That will help. The second thing we can do is really turn up the pressure federally. We need the United States Senate to pass the For the People Act. It's the biggest voting rights bill since the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and it would repeal or safeguard, it would repeal the worst voter suppression stuff you see coming out of Florida, Georgia, and Texas, and it would safeguard voting rights in those states and throughout the country. Almost every single Democratic member of the United States Senate supports this. President Biden has endorsed the legislation. We now just need it to pass. Calling your senator isn't going to hurt, but I'd also argue that letting the White House know how you feel. I know President Biden supports this, but I want him to know how much we all support this and that we're counting on him at this moment. And then the third thing that we need to do, of course, is win elections going forward. And if we're going to win state house seats in Texas and Georgia and Florida and Arizona in 2022, we got to do a lot of work right now in 2021. In Texas, that means signing up to become a volunteer deputy registrar, or a VDR. It's a peculiar provision of state election law in Texas. You can't register to vote online. You have to go down to the county courthouse to get registered, which helps to explain how hard it is. So if you sign up to become a volunteer deputy registrar, you can literally go knock on your neighbor's door and get them signed up to vote. And just as importantly, begin a conversation with them now in 2021 that can be continued into 2022, when down the road, we might want to ask them for their vote.
Do you think that President Biden has made passing H.R. 1 enough of a priority?
No. I'm really grateful that throughout his career, he has supported voting rights in the Senate as vice president. And again, he's endorsed this legislation, I believe, as president. But this is the most important bill that could pass the Senate, more important than anything else, because everything else depends on the ability of our democracy fully functioning. And if we don't get this right, I don't think anything else truly becomes possible, except perhaps a absolute demolition of Democratic electoral prospects in 2022. As Amanda Littman, one of my all-time heroes who runs Run for Something and has tried to keep us focused on our state legislative races, has said, the average voter may not know or care about the filibuster, may not know that For the People Act is pending in the Senate, but they will know if Democrats were in the White House, the United States House of Representatives, and the Senate, and were not able to meaningfully improve their lives beyond what they've already done, which is not insignificant. They'll know that, and that will have a bearing on what they do at the ballot box. So I think for democracy, for sure, and most importantly, but also for the rest of the Biden-Harris agenda over the next 3 years, over the next 7 years, it's imperative that this passes. And John, if we look back at a similar moment where democracy was really being tested in the mid-'60s, John Lewis had literally just been beaten within an inch of his life, crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge, trying to get to Montgomery from Selma. A week later, Lyndon Baines Johnson is addressing a joint session of Congress. And the first thing he says, he refers back to what John Lewis has just done. And he said, look, folks, we have got to act. And he says, look, you may think the poll tax and the literacy test apply to everyone equally. They don't. If we're honest with ourselves, and he was from Texas, he understood the South and the former Confederacy. These are mechanisms designed to disenfranchise Black voters. So we got to do the right thing. This is very much like this moment, where in Texas, there's talking about just standardizing the elections. Who could be against that? And we're going to apply it equally to all voters. President Biden understands exactly what is happening. He needs to call it out, call the country together, bring both chambers together and say, this is the most important thing that we can do together, not as Democrats, not as Republicans, but as Americans at this moment. This is our moment of truth. let's not be found wanting. So I hope that he will pursue that course.
Yeah, like I very much appreciate that Joe Biden and every Democrat in Washington has a Joe Manchin problem, has a Kyrsten Sinema problem, but I do think that it's time to sort of both amp up the public pressure, and privately, I hope they're all sort of putting a little pressure on those two senators and anyone else who's still wavering on the filibuster, because I don't really see any other option here.
I agree. That's the ball game.
It seems like regardless of voting restrictions, Democrats will have to do a better job of reaching voters where they are if we're going to turn Texas blue. I saw that you said to Ron Brownstein it was stupid for Democrats to abandon in-person organizing because of the pandemic, or entirely abandon it because of the pandemic. And I remember you being concerned about that last time we spoke on the pod, and you were going door to door. Do you think the end of the pandemic alone solves this problem in future elections, or is there even more for Democrats to do?
Yeah, I think there's more for Democrats to do. Certainly we'll see more Democrats out there. And I mean, I don't know the partisan makeup of the crowd that came together at the state capitol in Austin on Saturday, but it was the largest gathering during the entire legislative session so far, which says something. And John, there was a lot of energy, there was a lot of electricity. There were a lot of people making commitments to themselves that they were going to get out there and become volunteer deputy registrars, or get behind great candidates, or go knock on their neighbor's door. I think that's a great sign. But in addition to all of that, we've got to go to the places that are a little bit harder to reach. Might take 2 flights if you're flying there, might take a 10-hour drive if you're driving, which is about the distance from El Paso to Laredo, Texas. It's even further if I want to go down to true South Texas and the Rio Grande Valley. But if we're not at those voters' doors, and if we're not at those voters' doors prepared to listen to them in Spanish as well as in English, and not show up, by the way, in 2022 and say, hey, remember, early voting starts next week. I'm here to tell you where your polling place is. We got to be there now in 2021, saying, you just tell me what's most important in your life, and I'm here to listen and understand. And then I'd like to, over the course of time, connect you with great candidates who represent the answers to the questions that you're asking, the solutions to the problems that you posed when I showed up. If we're not willing to do that work, we will lose those parts of Texas, those parts of America. And if the great sin is that the Republican Party is that they're trying to, keep these folks from voting, then our sin historically is we have not shown up to give these folks a reason to vote. And that's why you have such low voter turnout historically along the border. And it's why you have a real cause for concern in terms of how well Trump performed in these communities in 2020. So we as good a job as Democrats did in 2018 in Texas, for example, and in many other places, I think we have to redouble our efforts and go even harder, even bigger in these much tougher to reach places, while at the same time not taking for granted Houston and Dallas and San Antonio and El Paso and Austin. We got to show up there as well, and you got to be doing it now. And so we have a group called Powered by People that is working really hard on voter registration and early voter engagement and long, deep canvassing conversations now. And we're doing it in Laredo, and we're doing it along the border. And it's tough. It is really slow going. And they're very often very uncomfortable, not easy conversations. And you really get the sense that these places are in play for the first time in a while. So we've got our work cut out for us. But as long as we are on it now, as long as we take inspiration and cue from Nsé Ufot and Stacey Abrams and the great, decade-long project in Georgia, and understand this is day in, day out, year in, year out, cycle in, cycle out, we can get this done. But yes, there's a lot more for us to do.
I'd love to hear a little bit about some of those conversations, particularly around the Latino vote and Trump doing better among Latinos in 2020 than he did in 2016, specifically in the Rio Grande Valley in South Texas. I've talked to a lot of Latino strategists, Chuck Rocha and Carlos Odio and Stephanie Valencia, about this. And, one of the theories is that, a lot of non-white conservatives started voting for Republicans at higher rates than before. So these are Black and especially Latino voters who used to vote for Democrats even though they thought of themselves as a little more conservative, and now are starting to vote more like conservative Republicans and sort of more white conservative voters. Do you think there's any truth to this, or what are some of the things that you heard in 2020, especially from Latinos, about why they might possibly want to vote for Trump or Republicans?
So I went on one of these canvassing trips to Laredo a few weeks ago, and I was going door to door, primarily talking to people who were registered to vote in 2020 and did not cast a ballot, to find out why, whether they were happy with the results of the election and what they'd like to see going forward. And I was somewhat surprised by how open so many of these voters are to voting for Trump or someone like Trump. And a lot of it comes down to the corruption, perceived and real, that they see in Washington, D.C., that they see in Austin, Texas, that they see in Laredo in this case. And this message that has extraordinary resonance of draining the swamp or blowing the place up or throwing the bums out or not speaking in the politically correct language and just calling things what they are, regardless of who does that. In this case, it was Trump. But essentially, the status quo, including, importantly and uncomfortably for a Democrat like me, the status quo of Democratic leadership has not served these people well. The minimum wage is still $7.25 an hour. We're still the least insured state in the country, which means people in Laredo are dying of diabetes. Folks work hard, do not seem to be getting ahead. All of their local representation is Democratic. The state representation is Republican, of course. The last administration was Republican, but to some degree, they're just saying, to the hell with all of them. I'm not going to vote, or if I am going to vote, I'm going to vote for the person who's going to most radically change the system that has done me so much harm or has done nothing for me at all. The most pressing issues that I hear beyond corruption are economic ones, insecurity about how long I'm going to be able to keep this job or whether I'm going to be able to get a job. And I think Trump's false choice between your health and the economy, preventing you from getting COVID or your ability to keep your job, really worked in South Texas along the border and in Laredo. And then healthcare and anger around that. And frankly, the really good job that Trump and Abbott and others have done of scapegoating recent immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers over and over again. John, I heard from people, my family did this the right way. We waited in line for our visas. We applied to sponsor our sisters and cousins and aunts to come over. We worked really hard. And we see these people who just waltz right into the United States and get everything, hotel rooms, healthcare, schooling for their kids. Most of that is actually not true. But all of that has been said by Trump and Abbott without an effective counter message from Democrats, because in large part, Democrats are not showing up and knocking on their doors and talking to them. There's a lot that we're working against right now. And I think the only way to do it is to be there and have those conversations in real time.
It does seem like that the Biden administration strategy, and people in the administration have sort of said this, is if we can pass enough legislation to actually deliver for voters, if we can pass things that will tangibly improve people's lives, then people will connect that improvement with government actually doing good, and that will sort of be enough for a lot of people who maybe thought that Washington wasn't delivering for them to say, okay, now Washington is delivering, now I can support Democrats. Do you agree with that? Do you think that's enough?
Yeah, I think that's definitely helpful. And I will say this, what the Biden-Harris administration and the democratically controlled Congress have accomplished in the first 5 months of this year is really extraordinary. And it is making a meaningful, immediate impact in people's lives. And we did hear some of that as well. And it's in part a counter to the perceived impact that Donald Trump had on their lives. When someone told me I picked up a box of food from the food bank and there was a letter from Donald Trump in it. I got a relief payment and it was signed by Donald Trump. This guy was delivering for me. I think that the Biden administration has delivered in a much more meaningful way in a much shorter period of time. They're probably not shameless enough for my taste, John. Actually, I'd love for them to take more credit for that. It goes a long way. It goes a long way in a state like Texas, where the media and the big microphones are dominated by Republicans and their lies. You need this real stuff to get through, and you got to be, you got to be a little shameless is maybe the best word I can find for it. But yes, more of that. And I think more of it and the most of it is only going to be possible if you pass for the people and if you amend the rules to the filibuster to get more of this stuff through. And whether it's minimum wage or healthcare protections or paid family leave or all of these things that would make such a huge difference in the day-to-day life of these people that I'm listening to right now. If you do that and then follow it up with somebody at their door saying, hey, I'm here to see how you all are doing and to tell you that we can build on this success at the state level with this great state rep candidate, this great gubernatorial candidate, this great US senator candidate. And then when 2024 rolls around, now with 40 electoral college votes, Texas, I really do think could be the deciding state, at least the biggest battleground state in the country. But we're not going to win in 2024 unless we're doing that work now in 2021.
I know you've been teaching. I know you've been on the ground organizing. How much do you miss campaigning all over Texas?
I really miss it, to be honest with you. I just drove 8.5 hours Friday night to be at that rally with Secretary Castro and others in Austin, and then got in my truck and drove 8.5 hours back that next day. And, I felt it in terms of, the endurance and a little bit of the exhaustion, but I also felt it in being with all these people who want to work together to make something really positive happen in Texas and who want to fight something that is really terrible for Texas right now. And so, when you're tempted to despair, when you say, man, this shit could not get any worse, and then you show up and see 500 people who left their homes and drove their own distance from their hometowns to be at the Capitol and come together and fight together, that's pretty damn inspiring. And yeah, I miss that a lot. And I'll tell you, the organizing at the doors in Laredo, listen to people in Del Rio and Eagle Pass, going down to McAllen, as a candidate or as a volunteer, it really doesn't matter so much to me. Just being with people and doing this work at a time where I just don't know that it could be more important. Literally, democracy is on the line. And if we do not figure it out now, and I think in this year, I don't know that we're going to be able to save it. And I don't know that we're going to be able to keep moving forward in this great direction that the Biden-Harris administration have started us in. So it feels like the most important work we could all be doing. I'm just grateful to have a role in it.
What's your latest thinking on whether you might challenge Abbott for governor in 2022?
So I just finished teaching my last class at Texas State for the semester on Thursday. And now I've got to do my grading this week with my co-professor, Dr. Mora. And then I think I'm going to put some serious thought into this. And I guess really the larger question, where can I do the most good? With Powered by People last year, we registered 196,000 new voters in Texas. We made tens of millions of voter engagement calls. We're doing really great work on the ground now at people's doors throughout the state. That's deeply fulfilling. If that's where I have the greatest impact, and if I can get behind really great candidates and help to make them even more successful, that's wonderful. If it is best for me to be a candidate and run a campaign, then I will do that. But it's something to think through. It's certainly something to listen to people on, and then also just look at who else is out there and what all is happening in Texas. But one way or another, I'm going to give this all that I've got. I'm going to give this my life for as long as it takes to get it right.
Well, if you do announce, there's a podcast that would be happy to have you to talk about it. And if not, and if you don't announce, we'd love to have you back as well. So thank you for joining us as always. It was good talking to you.
Likewise, I appreciate it.